Both the RTX 4090 and 4080 have launched from NVIDIA, and while the RTX 4090 does offer up amazing performance, and so does the 4080 for that matter, the general consensus from reviewers and the general consumer is that they are just too far out of reach for most people. I mean, I get it, they were never aimed at the, let's say, average gamer, but coupling that with other less favourable tactics from Team Green has opened up a huge opportunity for AMD. Basically, for them to come in and steal a huge amount of market share with both the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX graphics cards. And that's what we're going to be looking at today in a variety of games. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits for my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. Now, before we get into it, we did do an unboxing type preview piece of content last week, so I'd definitely invite you to check that out in case you missed it, as we do go through quite a lot of detail on the general design of the cards and where it potentially is positioned in the market. But I will touch on that a little bit in this review as well. So while I do have the AMD reference cards here today, we will actually have further content on AIB models in the next couple of days, comparing cooling performance, overclockability, and all that good stuff that really separates each individual model. Now, if you checked out the launch announcement of the cards, you're probably more than familiar on kind of what's under the hood with these cards. But for, I guess, a bit of a recap, both of these cards are based on the RDNA 3 architecture, which, in a bold move, is the world's first chiplet-based GPU. Meaning that, unlike NVIDIA, who use a 4N process node, AMD have plumped for a mixture of 5nm for the GCD, or graphics compute die, and 6nm for the MCDs, or memory cache die units. In theory, this should provide higher yields and stock should be plentiful, though as we reported last week, there is chatter that Europe may have fewer than 7,000 reference GPUs on launch day. So I guess we'll wait and see what the outcome is with that. But with custom AIB models coming out after launch, there may actually be more stock than first thought. So with this new chiplet design and the way that the GPU is made up of different components, taking a look at the GPU size isn't as clear cut as it kind of differs slightly, with both the 7900 XT and XTX both incorporating a die size of 306mm squared. While the full size is actually larger at 495.5mm squared on the XT and 533mm squared on the XTX. Though both include the same 58 billion transistors, which is a little over double what the 6900 and 6950 XT had, which is pretty impressive on paper, especially considering that the RTX 4080 comes in with 12 billion less transistors. Though that's kind of like comparing apples to oranges, as it's completely different technologies and there's a lot more to consider when comparing them. So when looking at the main specs, it's a hard one to analyse because you could compare it to the RTX 4080, which I think is where AMD are hoping to take a lot of customers from, but also to the last generation 6900 series, because both of these cards could be argued as the natural successor path to them, especially as the 7900 XTX is keeping the same $999 price tag that the 6950 XT launched with, while the 7900 XT is coming in a little cheaper at $899 at launch. So, starting with the 7900 XT, which comes in with 84 compute units and the same amount of ray accelerators, which is only actually 4 more than the 6900 XT. But again, new architecture, apples and oranges, and kind of all of that. The shading units have seen a bump of around 5%, now sporting 5,376, and the same for the texture mapping units, now at 336, and a 50% increase in the ROPs, or render output units. Now, the 7900 XTX, however, has seen much larger bumps. Now with 96 compute units and ray accelerators, 6,144 shading units, 384 texture mapping units, and the same 192 ROPs as the 7900 XT. Where things get a bit more interesting is the different clock speeds that each card has, with the 7900 XT coming in with a base clock of 1500 MHz, a game clock of 2025 MHz, and a boost clock of 2394 MHz, while the XTX takes it a lot further with a much higher 1900 MHz base clock, 2269 MHz game clock, and a whopping 2499 MHz boost clock. Though if the Radeon RX 6500 XT has taught us anything, it's that having the fastest clocks in a gaming card means very little, as it's almost like confusing your rev counter with your speedometer. VTech kicked in, yo. AMD have also increased the memory clock speed on both cards from 2000 MHz or 16 gigabit per second effective on the 6900 XT and 2250 MHz or 18 gigabit per second effective on the 6950 XT to 2500 MHz or 20 gigabits per second effective on both the XT and XTX. So we have a little bit more headroom there as well. Now AMD have always had strong performance on the top tier last generation cards when it came to pure rasterization. And as we know, a lot of games are geared more for AMD technologies, while other games clearly favour NVIDIA. So a lot of that comes down to what games you play and what games you don't, as to kind of what could be the better choice for you. Now the place that they've generally, I guess, fell behind is within ray tracing performance, which we will look at a little later on, as based on what we've been told and shown, they do believe they've actually upped their game here too, which is arguably the area that they lack the most in. But knowing that they can't compete in certain areas, AMD has decided, I guess, to take a different approach of offering up the very best efficiency when it comes to power, especially when compared to the competition from NVIDIA. And this is done through a few different ways. Firstly, AMD have opted to use GDDR6 memory opposed to GDDR6X, which would generate less heat overall, and then couple that with what's been done by utilising the chiplet-based design, they've actually managed to make each card extremely efficient compared to the 40 series, with the 7900 XT rated at 300 watts, while the XTX comes in slightly higher at 355 watts, which is still dramatically less when looking at both the RTX 4080 and 4090. So let's take a closer look at each card, starting with the 7900 XT, which is the slightly smaller of the two cards. Firstly, I'll be as bold to say that AMD have really upped their game in kind of both the engineering and styling side of things. The card is just clearly a big step up from the reference 6900 XT and feels a lot more solid, and that shows just in kind of how it actually feels in your hand. Now in terms of the design, AMD have opted for a very stealthy look with minimal branding. So minimal in fact that the centre of the fans have kind of ditched that Radeon logo that looked like Team Rocket from Pokemon in favour of a quasi-predator praying mantis kind of looking logo. And there's no LEDs whatsoever, even though it looks like there should be, at least on the Radeon logo on the top of the card. Now the rear of the card has a fairly thick backplate, again finished in stealthy black, though it does include some subtle branding and red accents, and kind of moulds around to meet the front of the card towards the end. The only other small splash of colour is on the top of the card with 3 red lines, which may not be for everyone as it may disrupt the theme of your whole build, but it's not exactly a deal breaker for me. What is nice to see on the top is the fact that we have 2 8-pin PCI Express connectors, so no 12VH PWR connector here. In terms of the weight, the 7900 XT comes in at 1,745 grams and measures in at 276mm long, 112mm high, and will take up 2.5 slots inside your case, making it much more attractive than the 40 series from NVIDIA. When taking apart the card and taking the triple cooler shroud off, you do get to appreciate the sheer size of the large stealth black heatsink, which incorporates a large moulded panel that makes direct contact with the GPU core, as well as including copper plates that keep the memory under control as well. The PCB is a very clean layout with 10 2GB SK Hynix branded memory chips and what seems to be a 17-phase VRM design that is split between the GPU core and the memory, likely to be shared to provide the best efficiency overall, which, as I mentioned, is something AMD are taking very seriously. So its bigger brother, the 7900 XTX, is slightly larger as expected, though the design is kind of very similar to its little brother. AMD have also gone with a stealth black design and the same triple fan setup, though the fans are a few millimeters larger on the XTX, which is why the card is kind of slightly larger in length and height. Now the XTX does incorporate some LEDs with 4 small light bars in the middle of the card, which from what I can tell can't be turned off within software, but I guess there's nothing stopping you potentially just unplugging the cable for it. Though as it's white, I can't really see it being much of an issue for most gamers. The rear of the card is identical with a large thick backplate with red accents and some subtle Radeon branding, which I don't know, it would have been nice with the other Radeon branding to just maybe have an LED here, but AMD decided against that. Now again, the 7900 XTX includes two 8-pin PCI Express power connectors, and this was a big point that AMD made when announcing the cards, almost as a kind of sly dig to NVIDIA. Now the 7900 XTX does come in a little heavier at 2065 grams, measures in slightly bigger too, at 287mm long, 123mm high, and again will take up 2.5 slots inside your case, meaning that you'll have kind of very little to worry about in terms of your case, unlike NVIDIA's 40 series cards. When taking apart the card, it's a very similar build to the 7900 XT with a fan shroud that houses the 3 fans, and underneath a large black heatsink with a moulded plate that makes contact directly with the GPU and memory through copper plates. Again, the PCB has a pretty clean layout and features 12 2GB SK Hynix branded memory chips, giving us a total of 24GB of VRAM around the GPU core, which, funnily enough, you can actually see the chiplet design that the heat is kind of imprinted into the thermal paste. There's a total of 20 phases that again are split between the GPU and the memory, and word on the grapevine is that AIB cards could come with upwards of kind of 22 power phases, which may help with overclocking, of which we will find out how both the AMD reference cards do a little later on. So from the offset, it's hard to decipher just how good these cards are going to be. So I think it's time we had a look at exactly how they perform. Now, due to the high-end nature of both the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX, we will be focusing predominantly on higher resolutions to alleviate any bottleneck from the processor. But we will have all of the testing data up on our Patreon if you want to check out a lot more data across all resolutions. Now for our test bench, all GPUs were tested using the Intel Core i9-12900K based test system on the Asus Z690 Maximus Hero motherboard with 32GB of Patriot Viper Venom 6200MHz memory. For all GPUs we tested, resizable bar was enabled, and the 7900 XT and XTX were both tested using the 20.40.00.57 Adrenalin driver, while all other AMD cards were tested using the 22.10.1 driver. In terms of the NVIDIA cards, they were all tested on the 521.90 driver, with the exception being the RTX 4080, which was tested on the 526.72 driver. And Windows 11 21H2 was used for all of our testing. So with that out of the way, let's get into those glorious benchmarks. So starting things off with synthetic benchmarks and taking a look at 3D Mark Times by Extreme, where the RTX 4080 sits around 8% ahead of the 7900 XT in the overall score, while the XTX manages to creep ahead by a little under 3%. In Port Royal, the XTX drops slightly, which was expected, and now sits around 5% faster than last generation's flagship 3090 Ti, which is pretty impressive considering where the 6950 XT falls within our chart. As we move on to Puget Bench for DaVinci Resolve, both 7900 series cards give pretty solid performance in both the standard and extended tests, with the RTX 4080 sitting around 6% faster than the 7900 XTX in this test. So into gaming, and starting things off with a Plague Tale Requiem, where we see a nice boost of 16% over the 6950 XT when looking at the 7900 XT, and a healthy uplift of 26% when moving to the 7900 XTX, though it's still not enough to beat both the RTX 4080 and 4090 from NVIDIA at 1440p. At 4K, the fight gets a little closer between the 7900 XTX and the RTX 4080, only being separated by 2 frames per second, and 4 frames per second in the 1% lows. Though considering the cheaper price of the 7900 XTX, I'll chalk this up as a victory to AMD. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla at 1440p, we see things move around slightly, now with the 7900 XTX pushing ahead by around 6%, with much more favourable 1% lows, while the 7900 XT sits just below the RTX 4080, but comes in 16% faster than last generation's flagship 6950 XT. At 4K, it's a very similar story, with the XTX pushing ahead of the RTX 4080 by just over 4%, but with much better 1% lows as well, which almost rivals the RTX 4090, while the 7900 XT sits below the RTX 4080, but does perform around 11% better than the 6950 XT, and sits above last generation's flagship from NVIDIA. Moving on to Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and we see some really strong numbers from both 7900 model cards at 1440p, with the XTX nipping at the heels of the much more expensive RTX 4090, while the 4080 falls behind with both 7900 cards sitting 8% and 24% ahead respectively. As we move up to 4K, we do find the RTX 4080 and 7900 XT hovering around the same level of performance, while the 7900 XTX gives us a whopping 18% more over the 7900 XT, which pushes it closer to the level of the RTX 4090, which still sits 11% ahead of the new AMD flagship. Control at 1440p gave us some interesting results again, with the cheaper 7900 XTX outperforming the RTX 4080 by around 6%, and the 4080 sitting ahead of the XT by around 12%, though the RTX 4090 still sits in a league of its own at the top of our charts by quite some margin. But for the price, you'd kind of expect it to. At 4K, the battle draws ever closer, with the RTX 4080 now sitting 17% of the 7900 XT, while the XTX pushes ahead by a small margin of 2%. Again, the RTX 4090 sits miles ahead, but as this game is geared more towards NVIDIA cards, it is somewhat expected. Cyberpunk 2077 sees our first win for AMD, which now tops our chart by 0.7%, and I'm not even mad, as yes, this could be deemed as margin of error for a card that is 60% more expensive. I just expected NVIDIA to do better here. Now, in terms of the RTX 4080, it does sit slightly ahead of the 7900 XT, but still loses out to the much cheaper 7900 XTX by quite some margin. Then at 4K, NVIDIA fight back, though we still only see the RTX 4080 performing around 6% better overall, but costing 20% more to buy. So I'll let you do the maths on that if you think it's worth it, as the 7900 XTX still manages over 60 FPS at 4K on ultra settings. Death Stranding sees another win for AMD, though looking at the results and where the RTX 4090 is sitting, I'm going to deem it as some form of bottleneck from our CPU, as I'd expect that to top our charts here. Between all of the new cards from AMD and NVIDIA, the results are very close in both the averages and the 1% lows, so you wouldn't be disappointed in the performance on any of these cards anyway. At 4K, order is restored as the 4090 now sits at the top, though the 7900 XTX does sit slightly behind, but has significantly better 1% lows, and we also find the cheaper XT model outperforming the RTX 4080 by a small 1% margin. But considering it's $300 cheaper, this is actually a huge win for the Radeon-based GPUs. As we move on to Doom Eternal at 1440p, we see some strong numbers across the board, again with the 7900 XT sitting 5% faster than the last generation AMD flagship. Though the RTX 4080 still comes in with stronger performance overall, but again the cheaper XTX manages another 3% more performance over it, making it a better proposition along with better 1% lows than all of the other cards tested. The RTX 4080 fights back at 4K with very similar figures to the XTX and with better 1% lows as well. Though at 302 frames per second, I wouldn't be upset with such strong performance in the first place, while also having $200 in my pocket at the end of it. Dying Light 2 at 1440p sees the 4090 sitting in its own little world, while the 7900 XTX sits ahead of the RTX 4080 with much higher 1% low figures, leading to a better gameplay experience overall. While the 7900 XT gives a slight boost in performance over last generation's AMD flagship, which was already ahead of the 3090 Ti anyway. The position of the cards remain the same at 4K, with the RTX 4080 sitting between both 7900 series cards, making the argument for the XTX much more favourable due to its more attractive price point. F1 at 1440p clearly favours AMD-based GPUs, which storm ahead of everything NVIDIA have to offer, with similar performance across both 7900-based cards in the averages and the 1% lows as well, though CPU bottlenecks clearly play a factor at this resolution. At 4K, the RTX 4090 manages to push ahead, though not by as much as the 7900 XT, which takes our top spot. While the averages on the 4090 were good, it really suffered in the 1% lows, which both the 7900 XT and XTX excelled in with less dips overall. Far Cry 6 is another title at 1440p that really seems to favour AMD, though performance on the RTX 4090 is clearly hit by how truly fast it is, leaving an unbalanced system when factoring in the CPU. What we do see is that the XTX still manages to give around 8% more performance than the 7900 XT for 11% more cost, which would really come down to a personal choice you'd have to make. At 4K, that bottleneck disappears as the RTX 4090 regains its top spot by a margin of around 11%, though the 7900 XTX comes in with 33% better 1% lows overall, which also puts it ahead of the RTX 4080 in both the 1% lows and the average FPS. In terms of the 7900 XT, it does manage to come in around 4% faster than NVIDIA's last generation flagship though. Horizon Zero Dawn sees the 4080 beating the 7900 XTX again by a small margin of 2%, though at such a high frame rate to start with, it's not going to be noticeable anyway. Meanwhile, the 7900 XT only manages a measly 1% extra performance over the 6950 XT from last generation, so nothing really to write home about. At 4K, the 3090 Ti continues to push forward, almost matching the performance of the XTX, which sits just behind the RTX 4080, and the 7900 XT drops down the stack below the RTX 4090 by 1 frame per second. In Spider-Man at 1440p, again, AMD fares slightly better, with the 7900 XT and 7900 XTX performing 9 and 10% better respectively when compared to the RTX 4090, and sees an even stronger uplift of 15% and higher when compared to the RTX 4080, which remember is a much more expensive GPU to start with. At 4K, the 3090 Ti puts itself back in the mix when compared to the XT, though with a 1 FPS lead, it's hardly anything to shout home about, though the AMD card comes in with 7% better scores in the 1% lows. When looking at the 7900 XTX, we find around 3% more performance when compared to the more expensive RTX 4080 with identical 1% figures. Microsoft Flight Sim at 1440p gave some very similar results on all GPUs tested due to the severe bottleneck that our CPU provides at this resolution. Then, even at 4K, it's clear to see some form of bottleneck does occur, and the only real way of getting around it is utilising upscaling technology in addition to the likes of the 5800X3D processor from AMD. Finally, in Watch Dogs Legion, the 7900 XTX comes out on top with a 2 FPS lead over the RTX 4090 and a 12% lead over the RTX 4080, which is the more expensive card, while the 7900 XT, which is even cheaper, still manages to come out faster than the RTX 4080 by a small 2% margin. At 4K, the RTX 4080 fights back with a small lead of less than 5% compared to the 7900 XT, though the XTX puts it in its place with an 11% lead over the Ada Lovelace GPU. Again, the much more expensive NVIDIA flagship pushes ahead by quite some margin, but cost-wise, they are in two entirely different realms. Now, rasterization is one area that AMD have always had a strong position in, with the likes of the 6900 XT and 6950 XT, and that's clear to see that it's carried over onto the RDNA 3 based cards. But an area where NVIDIA have always had the upper hand is in ray tracing. So it's only fitting that we look at how the 7900 series have moved on, because the last generation didn't exactly see great things from Team Red in terms of ray tracing. So starting things off with Cyberpunk, where both the 7900 XT and XTX fall behind the RTX 4080. While FSR does gain some performance back, the RTX 4080 with DLSS, and especially DLSS 3, is just too much to contend with. In Control, the 7900 XT offers up similar performance to the RTX 4080 with ray tracing turned on, but as FSR isn't supported in this game and DLSS is, NVIDIA manages to claw back quite a lot of performance when enabled. Meanwhile, the ray tracing performance has still stepped up quite a bit when compared to last generation's flagship, especially considering how demanding Control is with ray tracing enabled. In Spider-Man, the 7900 XT and XTX both give strong performance, which is quite a large step up from the 6950 XT, and now sees the XTX only sitting a few frames per second behind the RTX 4080. With each card's respective upscaling technologies enabled, we see them fight again, only a few frames per second between them. But with DLSS 3, the Ada Lovelace GPU still has an upper hand here. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, we again see a large step up in ray tracing performance of around 50% when comparing the 6950 XT and 7900 XTX. This also puts it around 11% behind the RTX 4080, which is pretty impressive, though the upscaling technology of DLSS more than makes up for it and gives a win to Team Green. So, just like normal, that's a ton of data that we've gone through, and I think it's fair to say that it's easy to see what stands out and what doesn't in each individual test. For the most part, the 7900 XTX sat between the RTX 4080 and 4090, which I feel is where AMD wanted to position the card all along, while the 7900 XT either came in close or fell somewhat behind in most instances. Now, obviously looking at individual game data is perfect for those who only play specific game titles, but some would argue the best way to get a better understanding would be to look at overall game averages across a larger pool of titles. What we then see here is at 1440p, the 7900 XT puts up a good fight against the much more expensive RTX 4080, which only manages to push ahead by less than 2%. While the 7900 XTX comes out over 8% faster, bearing in mind that it's also $200 cheaper when looking at the MSRPs. Also at 1440p, we do find the 7900 XTX very close performance-wise to the RTX 4090, though I'm well aware that's due to bottlenecking, as the 4090 is just so fast in the first place. At 4K, however, the RTX 4090 really does manage to stretch its legs, which is expected due to its price point. That aside, the 7900 XT and XTX both sit either side of the RTX 4080 with around 8% performance between each of them. With gaming performance to one side, it's only fair that we look at the performance of the cooler and the power delivery. Now on the 7900 XT, temperatures remained pretty consistent throughout our testing, with a GPU temperature that sat around 64 to 65 degrees. The memory junction temperature hit the low 90s, but didn't seem to deviate away from that too much. Now the GPU core clock saw levels hitting around 2350 MHz, but for the most part sat at 2270 MHz, with 100% GPU usage. Power-wise, the card was consistently sitting at 309 watts, with the fan speed remaining pretty reasonable and inaudible at 1750 RPM. The 7900 XTX saw some pretty good figures in terms of the temperatures too, with the GPU rising to around 66 degrees, while the memory junction temperature constantly sat around the same 90 degree mark. Now in terms of the GPU core clock, we did have instances where it hovered around 2400 MHz with 100% GPU utilization. And during this, the total board power did rise to around 345 watts, with the fans remaining pretty quiet again at 1700 RPM. So, the AMD RDNA 3 based GPUs. What a ride! And I say that because there are some ups and some downs, so sorry AMD, it's not all good news. So AMD had to do one thing with these cards, and I think it's safe to say they did it. They had to either be equal to or better than the RTX 4080, and to come in cheaper. Well, mission accomplished. The 7900 XTX is simply fantastic, and is $200 cheaper, which sounds frankly amazing. But a part of me still has to put my thoughts and feelings into the mind of the consumer, and $1,000 is still a lot of money. Luckily, this should give an indication as to what's to come in the future as we move down the stack to GPUs that are likely to offer up competitive levels of performance for much cheaper prices. I'm talking about the likes of the 7600 and 7700 series, that if AMD can give the same treatment to, should see them cleaning up, and that's for multiple reasons. AMD has a strong and, dare I say it, superior product, at least in terms of rasterization, and for a cheaper price. And what is cheaper to run? It ticks all of the right boxes, and in a time where the cost of living is so high, it just makes sense. Also, coupled with the fact that a lot of consumers have completely lost faith in NVIDIA, just makes looking at the 7900 series much more favourable. Now between the two models, the 7900 XTX just makes more sense. It's $100 more than the XT, but I feel like you get so much more for your money. If anything, I think the XT should have been part of the 7800 series and come in at maybe $799. Because if I was on the market, I'd just stop buying a coffee every day or have one less takeout and find that extra money to buy the XTX. It's funny, as I know a lot of people who were dead set on buying the XT, but I think after seeing this, it will definitely change their minds. Obviously, at the time of testing, we have no understanding on stock levels, and with AIB cards coming too, it's going to be an interesting one to see how prices sit based on supply and demand, and what consumer reception is going to be like, especially with how close we are to Christmas. Now, one area that was surprising was ray tracing. AMD knew that they had to do something here, and they really did. AMD managed to step up performance quite dramatically compared to last generation, and in some cases only fell just behind NVIDIA's RTX 4080. Now, as NVIDIA are now on their third generation of ray tracing based cards, and this is AMD's second stab at it, it's a huge increase in an area they didn't do that well in before. I still think there's some areas to work on, but with the likes of FSR being completely open source and now having the ability to use plugins for the likes of Unreal Engine, for instance, it's a definite one to watch, as this could really be a legitimate product that could get better over time as technologies like this are adopted kind of more freely by developers and now modders. Overall, AMD have impressed me today, and that's not surprising. AMD were pretty clear with what their intentions were, and I think that they knew they couldn't afford to mess up. And with the 7900 XT to one side, the 7900 XTX really is a beast of a card. So the big question is, are you going to get one? Or are you going to wait for maybe one of the AIB cards? Or are you waiting for something lower end that can harness the true potential of RDNA 3? I can't see them being too far away. Maybe with CES around the corner, that's what AMD will announce. It's an exciting time to be a gamer. And most importantly, will we now see the RTX 4080 drop in price? We'll have to wait and see. For now, I've got a lot more testing to do as we have a few AIB cards to bring you performance numbers on, so you won't want to miss out on that. So make sure you're subscribed. Also, if you like this video, then a like and a sub to the channel would be amazing. And if you love what we do, then consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a lot more testing data, behind the scenes content, and exclusive access to a super secret area over on our Discord. The link for all that good stuff is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.